In this video, we'll see that the nature of scientific progress is convoluted, with many false starts, but that the manner in which we teach science simplifies this down to a straight line of progress. I'll show that this disconnect creates dysfunction that holds back scientific advancement. I'll conclude with some ideas for how we might fix this problem. Before we get to this, I should stress something. What I will cover is most strongly associated with the life sciences. I think it also applies to chemistry and many other branches of science. The physicists, however, are better with respect to the issues I discuss. They do, of course, have their own problems with pedagogy, but that will have to wait for another video. I'll start by saying that there are different kinds of science. There is what you call incremental research, for example. Here you are working inside the box, fleshing out our understanding of some reasonably well understood problem. Then there is science that breaks new ground. This can be the small but unexpected advances of the sort that happen every year, or it can be a major paradigm shift. This video is about science that breaks new ground, and not just major discoveries, but the discovery of anything new. I'll start with an analogy to evolution to get the main idea across before we get to the topic at hand. This particular analogy is deep, as the nature of the scientific process is similar in many ways to an aspect of the evolutionary process. You may have seen this depiction of human evolution. Explaining why this figure is wrong was a big goal of Stephen Jay Gould, and this part of the video follows his work. The novel part of the video lies in how I apply the same logic to the scientific process. There I am not following any particular author, but rather giving you my personal take. Returning to this depiction of evolution, it shows an evolutionary progression from simple to derived, along a predictable path. Derived, by the way, is just a fancy term for much changed. Essentially, every new hominid was a little more human-like than the last, and this implies that evolution had a goal. You have probably seen similar evolutionary progressions for horses or other animals. Such figures used to be immensely popular. In reality, the human evolutionary tree looks more like this. There are tons of branches and dead ends with only a few lineages lasting until near the present. It is thus more of a bush than a progression. In fact, evolution generally produces changes that result in bushes or complex trees of variation, not ladders. There was thus no inexorable progression towards modern humans and our particular mix of traits, but rather a progression in many directions to many different kinds of hominids. This figure takes all of this complexity and trims it away. You could say a figure like this shows the part of the evolutionary process we care about, that is our direct ancestors, but this is misguided. To use a cliche, the abundance of the branches are a feature, not a bug of the evolutionary process. You should never think in terms of linear progressions because they don't exist. If you get used to looking at such pictures, you will end up with a gut feeling that greatly oversimplifies the evolutionary process. I think that's enough for this section focused on setting the stage for the analogy. Let's turn to the main topic of the session. We'll start with how science is taught to students. This applies to both early science education and advanced classes in college. It's a lot like the linear picture of evolution. In other words, we trace the history of a currently accepted scientific belief to its precursor ideas back to its origin, ignoring all dead ends. And dead ends abound in science. For example, do you know what phlogiston or caloric theory are? Probably not, although they were hugely popular ideas in their time. These are old dead ends, not even taught to scientists who specialize on the relevant topic, which is thermodynamics. At most, your average practicing scientist has heard of the more famous dead ends, like the steady-state theory of the universe, or the idea that proteins carry genetic information. But even for these cases, if you ask them to explain the dead end in any depth, they often can't do better than a sentence or two. Which is not surprising since they were never taught these ideas, and they're too busy as professionals to do scholarship on ideas that went nowhere. Less famous dead ends, incidentally, are almost unknown to everyone who did not personally experience them. Let me give some more detailed examples to make my point. Consider evolution. The books we use in school tell us Darwin discovered natural selection. Then Mendel's work on genetics was rediscovered. Then a modern synthesis occurred in which the two ideas were merged together to form modern evolutionary theory. This is true, but it is quite like the linear evolution progression story. What actually happened is that Darwin proposed natural selection, but the scientific community did not believe him because he got heritability badly wrong. Because natural selection was rejected by most biologists in Darwin's time, many new theories of evolution emerged, such as mutationism, orthogenesis, and various neo-Lamarckian views. These turned out to be dead ends, even though they were more popular than natural selection for many years. When Mendel was rediscovered, a handful of mathematical biologists were able to rescue natural selection using a corrected notion of heritability. This complete version of natural selection was a far better explanation of the data than were any of the competing theories, which quickly died out. And the full story is more complex than even this, since competing versions of the modern synthesis existed. To top it all off, Darwin himself proposed an idea called pangenesis, which was strongly neo-Lamarckian in nature. Lamarckism refers to the inheritance of acquired traits, as in I work out all the time, so my kids will be born stronger than they would have otherwise. Darwin's Lamarckian ideas are often left out of modern discussions of evolution. Some people are uncomfortable with the messiness of scientific history, others are fine with it but don't like to take the time to explain what really happened. It doesn't take away from Darwin's greatness, however, to admit that he couldn't figure it all out by himself. He made a tremendous contribution after all. Let's take another famous example, continental drift. When Alfred Wegener proposed it, it was rejected because he had no mechanism for how continents could move. It also sounded far-fetched, which can be common for novel ideas. For a while, rival hypotheses that could account for why the continents seemed to fit together like a puzzle and why the fossils matched at the boundaries dominated. These all turned out to be dead ends, and eventually evidence proving Wegener right prevailed, leading to the modern theory of plate tectonics. I could give many more examples, but this is enough. Incidentally, this stuff may seem esoteric now, that is interesting in a trivial pursuit kind of way, but not practically important, but that is not the case. Trust me, I'm going to explain why this stuff is practically important, and why not teaching it correctly is causing problems. Let's turn now to why all of this richness of history is not taught to science students. Take cell biology. The introductory cell biology textbook has over 1,000 pages, and these pages are big and have relatively fine print. This book provides little information about how we made the discoveries that are inside. It simply presents what we know. To include the direct history of the correct ideas, along with all the popular dead ends, would make for a book of 50,000 pages at least, utterly impossible for any busy student or even practicing scientist to learn. So our style of teaching can be forgiven. For most courses, there is simply no time to do justice to the process of science. However, we cannot be entirely forgiven for teaching science this way, for reasons I'll get to shortly. So far, we have seen that the scientific process gives rise to a branching bush of ideas, like the bush of species produced by natural selection. Ideas rise and fall in popularity, and most go extinct, but some persist because they turn out to be true, or at least we can't prove them false. However, when we teach science, we focus on simple progressions from one major success to another. So why does all this matter? It matters because teaching linear depictions of scientific progress year after year leaves students with a strong, often subconscious belief that this is really how science works. More importantly, it gives a false sense of security regarding the likelihood that popular contemporary ideas are correct. I'll introduce now what I call the spectrum from skepticism to complacency. We're all familiar with scientific skepticism. It is the stance that most new hypotheses are wrong, so we're initially quite skeptical of them. To get past our skepticism, we require proof. As more proof rolls in, our skepticism decreases. Skepticism is fundamentally important in science, but what is the opposite of skepticism? In other words, what grows as skepticism fails? I call that complacency. It is the belief that conventional wisdom is right. There is thus an inverse relationship between skepticism and complacency, as shown in the figure on the right. What determines how much complacency exists? In the textbook version of how science works, it's the accumulation of solid experimental evidence, and if this were true, there would be little problem. However, science doesn't work the way it's supposed to any more than governments do. Ideas routinely take on an aura of conventional wisdom without any good experimental support. Both mutationism and the idea that proteins carry genetic information were like that for many years. Weak ideas can take on the status of conventional wisdom for many reasons, most of which go beyond the scope of this video. One common method will serve our purposes. In science, we are often in a position of struggling to explain something for which we have no good answer. Sometimes in this situation, the most famous person or people in a field have a pet hypothesis that they put all their weight behind. The power of the most accomplished scientist is vast. They control funding in some cases, they train a large number of young scientists, most of whom share their views. They act as editors at top journals where they affect to some extent what gets published and what doesn't. Before you know it, there's a large body of hand-wavy but well-cited work on some big shot's favorite hypothesis. In all of this activity, the fact that it's just a hypothesis with little to no experimental support gets lost in the mix. Of course, a minority of scientists always have alternative hypotheses, and in the present scenario, it is one of these that turns out to be true. However, the time it takes for the correct hypothesis to take over is a direct function of the degree of complacency for the conventional wisdom. If the average scientist who acts as a referee in peer review is scornful of new ideas and exhibits extreme skepticism, as opposed to a healthy skepticism, then the process of overturning bad ideas can take forever. Let's return now to teaching. Consider a young student who has learned the linear progression of science for years. It's subconsciously embedded in how they think. They believe major changes in thought are exceedingly rare events. Thus, when they start working on a topic for which conventional wisdom is a house of cards, it's quite easy for them to join in the complacency of the believers. To get to the bottom line, a scientist needs to have a healthy balance of skepticism and complacency. There's a time to be skeptical and a time to be complacent, but how can one acquire this balance unless they have a true knowledge of the path that science takes? If you know that the minority position can with some regularity overturn conventional wisdom, then you're not scornful of new or challenging ideas. Moreover, you're on your guard for those special cases of conventional wisdom for which complacency of the supporters is misguided. What I am getting at is that scientists should study certain kinds of incorrect science, even bad science, as well as that of the correct science, in order to spot the difference between the two in contemporary science, for which the jury is still out. And this can be best accomplished by studying major dead ends in scientific history. Let's conclude now by talking about what we can do to fix these problems. Of course, teaching the whole history of every scientific problem is utterly impossible, as I already discussed. However, what we can do is add two sorts of courses to the scientific curriculum. First, we can produce a course or two that focuses on why science sometimes gets stuck on weak and incorrect ideas. Here, the approach would be to take a deep dive into 5 or 6 dead ends. The goal would be to identify recurring themes in such cases. Is it always the abuse of the appeal to authority, or are there psychological biases associated with groupthink and resistance to change that cause us to sometimes collectively take the wrong turn and then stubbornly stick to it? The way it is now, science tends to forget about its failures, particularly the embarrassing ones, but you can't learn from your mistakes if you don't confront them honestly. The second thing we can do is teach scientific critical reasoning. You might be shocked to hear that a course in this is not already part of the scientific curriculum. Philosophers take courses in what's called informal logic, but scientists do not, even though such ideas are just as useful for us as they are for them. It would take a whole video to properly introduce this topic, but for now I'll just say that the goal of informal logic is to identify and classify weak arguments. We already have some of these in science, like correlation is not causation, but there are many other rules of thought unknown to a surprising number of scientists. Well, that's it for this video. I hope I convinced you that although science takes many wrong turns, there's much to learn from studying the whole process. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, and tell your friends about the channel. See you next time.